Many of us, even outside of the true crime verse, will always remember the Slender Man stabbing case. 3 12-year-old girls walk into the woods, 2 walk out, while one young girl was left fending for her life.
This was a serious criminal case, attempted murder. There are 2 defendants in the case. Both were children at the time that it happened, 12 years old. The victim was a child.
Thankfully, the victim survived. Now we're 11 years after what could have been a deadly stabbing. Anissa Weier was released from the mental hospital nearly 4 years ago. Now Morgan Geyser, the young woman who was just 12 years old when she stabbed her classmate Peyton 19 times, wants out of the mental hospital too. I'm Elizabeth Millner for Law&Crime. This isn't a deja vu story. Morgan Geyser has been wanting out of the mental hospital for years now. She was granted conditional release earlier this year. She was set to go on to the outside world, but a judge put a pause on that after troubling allegations came to light. Earlier this year, 3 different mental health professionals who evaluated Morgan Geyser over the years all agreed she was ready to be released from the mental health facility.
At this point, I am in favor or in support of her petition for conditional release. Specifically, I don't believe that she currently poses a significant risk of substantial harm to herself, others, or to property damage.
She has had, I think, what can only be called a bizarre adolescence. And needs help with sort of developmental issues. She has had very limited exposure to peers. She's had very limited access to education and independence. And so she's going to need a lot of help in becoming the mature person that she wants to be.
What's your ultimate conclusion in this case with respect to Ms. Geyser's petition for conditional release?
I believe it's appropriate.
Her compliance in the institution is remarkable, both with medication and with treatment. Her lack of behavioral management problems in the institution, her lack of violence toward others in the institution and toward herself. Those all bode well for her readiness for conditional release at this time.
In reviewing all of the reports and the matters, I'm satisfied that under the circumstances that the court's going to grant the release. I'm satisfied that by clear and convincing evidence that under the current set of circumstances, Ms. Geyser does not pose a significant risk of bodily harm to herself or others, or of serious property damage. Now, when I make that finding, I take into account what happened. I take into account the dangerousness of what happened back in 2014. I take into account, though, what's happened since then, in particular in the last 6 months. I take into account the opinions of the doctors, but in particular, and it's been an important analysis for the court to make, that as the Randall decision talks about, that the ultimate determination of dangerousness requires a careful balancing of society's interest in protection from harmful conduct against the acquittee's interest in personal liberty and autonomy. In looking at the Randall case and of what happened in Randall and what the circumstances were of Randall, when I contrast Randall to Geyser, there's a tremendous difference in the rationale for rejecting supervised release in that case, in Randall's case versus in this matter. When I weigh that dangerousness concept and I come back to what happened and what the progress has been, Ms. Geyser doesn't fall into the same category as Mr. Randall in his petition for release and the denial of that release. So on that standpoint, I'll grant the petition so ordered.
I'm sure for Morgan, hearing she'll finally get out of the mental health facility, probably exciting for her, terrifying for her victim Peyton. But the judge ordered a plan be put in place to house her in a group home, and that plan was supposed to be ready this week. However, that plan came crashing down when the staff at the Winnebago Mental Institute, where she's been committed for years, got concerned. So the judge paused her release so he could get to the bottom of those concerns. The full scope isn't fully clear. There was a hearing last week, but the court sealed the petition from the Wisconsin Department of Health Services. But this is what we know. According to prosecutors, Morgan Geyser was in contact with an older man outside of the facility, and there were concerns about some of the books she was reading at the facility. No, it wasn't Harry Potter or The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. It was reading material with themes of sexual sadism, murder, selling human organs on the black market, according to prosecutors. It's a crazy new development given all the psychologists touting Morgan's progress that she's made. So obviously the defense is going to object. They claim that information isn't new and it should have been known, so there was no failure to disclose from Morgan's standpoint. Her attorney argues Morgan doesn't even have access to the internet, and the thousands of books she read while being at Winnebago were all provided by the facility in the first place. Her attorney says she wasn't reading anything that wasn't already permitted in the facility, so it wasn't a secret, and her release shouldn't be delayed. When it comes to the unnamed older man she was talking to, Morgan's attorney says she asked for no contact with that person. Again, the full extent of that relationship isn't fully clear. So what happens next? Well, right now, Morgan isn't going anywhere, but the same judge who's been overseeing the case from the beginning will take it up at a hearing set for later this week. But the stakes are high. If Morgan's release is pushed, the judge that's been overseeing her case is set to retire next month, meaning another judge will get the case, possibly delaying the release even longer. I'm joined now by former Palm Beach County State Attorney Dave Ehrenberg. Dave, always great to see you, and thank you so much for joining me. You know, the Slender Man stabbing case continues to make headlines. Last time I reported on this story, Morgan Geyser was set to be released. Now the judge put a pause on that plan. Does that decision come as a surprise to you?
Not really, because the initial plan was to have her serve decades in prison, or at the very least in the mental health facility. When the deal was reached, she was able to avoid serious incarceration and went to a mental health facility. But now here we are 11 years after the stabbings, and she's ready to be released. And then they find out she's had some visitors from the outside and some weird stuff she's been viewing inside the facility. First off, my question is, how does she have access to that? Her lawyers said that she didn't smuggle in anything. There's nothing from the outside that she is watching or reading. So how did she get access to this material within the facility? And the visitor log should tell us everyone she's been meeting with. So there's a lot more to it, I think, than we know at this point. But I'm glad, while we have these outstanding questions, that she's not being let out to the general public.
Yeah, and as you were mentioning, the defense is claiming that she was permitted to have these books and these types of materials, given that the facility has no internet access. So all of this was provided by the Winnebago Health Institute. What's your reaction to the defense's argument saying that she was permitted to read these types of materials, given that the prosecution is alleging that she was reading books about murder, sexual sadism, selling human organs, on the black market? But what do you make of the defense's argument there?
I'd like to know if it's true that the facility had these materials in their in-house library. And if it is true, then why? How are they allowed to have it? Now, perhaps it fell through the cracks that this material is not the subject of the book, but maybe there's passages in the book. Maybe it's a fiction book where it gets a little salacious in there. But when you're in a mental health facility, you should not be able to be reading stuff that brings out these carnal desires in you that lead you to do something, perhaps like stab someone many times. That's the whole Slender Man thing. She got lost in this fantasy. Well, you have to carefully monitor her. That's what makes me believe, like, what kind of facility is this? If it is true that she had access to this, was this really a very strict facility that would bring her back to mental health? Or was this something that was just like an adult daycare, which I would hope not. But there are a lot of details we don't know yet.
Exactly, and I know we'll learn more soon when that hearing happens this Thursday. And I remember covering previous hearings of Morgan Geyser, and many of the staff from the Winnebago Mental Health Institute said that Morgan was ready to be released. But it's surprising that they're actually the ones raising concerns about her release, given that their testimony, for the most part, was she's ready to be let go. She's ready to continue on with her life. In your opinion, do you think that Morgan Geyser pulled the wool over people's heads so that way she could be released, similar to Anissa Weier?
And it was not with the approval of the victim's family. I mean, the victim's family from the beginning didn't want this plea deal. And I understand. I mean, here are the people who committed this awful crime, and they're being let out while they're still young. It's not like, they're being let out and they're 80 years old. I mean, Morgan is what, 24? I mean, that's you got to be careful when you let someone out in the general public who had committed such an awful crime and with severe mental health issues. Because even though you may support their release, it's different when they're about to leave the facility and you know it's on you if another tragedy occurs. That's when all of a sudden people are like, well, let's take a step back and slow this down. It's one thing to say, I think she should be released like the other, but then once her foot exits the door, you may have some buyer's remorse. So that's why I think that people are saying, let's slow this down now.
And given that, do you think that the judge will actually prevent her from being released, given what we're learning right now? And if so, do you think that she'll have another opportunity to apply for release maybe later down the line? What do you think is going to be happening, especially come this hearing on Thursday?
If she's not released, then for sure she'll have another opportunity to apply for it down the line. But as far as what the judge will do, I think it's going to be dependent on the facts. We don't know all the facts. We know that the defense is saying she was given access to this within the facility, but we don't know exactly what the book was, whether it's true that the facility had this kind of material in there. So there are a lot of unanswered questions. And once we get those answers, then I think we'll have a better understanding of what comes next.
And it seemed like both sides obviously are going to be weighing whether or not Morgan Geyser is a risk to the public if she is released. But in your opinion, do you think that she is still a risk to the public, possibly, even though it's been, like you'd mentioned, more than a decade now?
11 years, and your brain does not stop developing as a young person until around 25. So do I think she's still a risk? Well, I'm an amateur. I'm not a doctor, but I would say yes. As a prosecutor, I would be very nervous about having her hit the streets without any supervision. So I would not favor her release. But again, I'm not with her every day. I'm not a doctor. But just as a former prosecutor and a human being who's concerned about public safety, yeah, I wouldn't be quick to unlock the door of the facility to let her free.
Absolutely. And I know that even at the time of the offense, they were just 12 years old. They were still very, very young. But take age out of this. Say that this had happened and Anissa Weier and Morgan Geyser were maybe 18, 19, 20 years old at the time that this happened, stabbing what was supposed to be a friend of theirs multiple times, so many times that she almost bled out to death and almost died from the incident. Do you think we'd even be having this conversation about release if, at the time of the offense, they weren't so young when this had happened?
Or if she died, if the victim died, I think we'd be having a very different conversation. But yes, of course, if they were not 12 years old at the time, no, they would still be facing years in a facility or behind bars. But because they were 12 years old and had serious mental health issues, there's a feeling that, well, they could be brought back to health. But now when you're seeing that she's gotten visitors who apparently concern people, and she had access to materials that she was reading that wasn't what someone in her position should be reading. Yeah, you don't get a second chance to undo this stuff. If something happens, God forbid, another tragedy, then it's on all of us who supported her release, because it could have been prevented. We have had the red flags already, and now just send her out into the public where you had someone who has clear delusions, who committed an atrocious crime, then it's something that you have to live with yourself and possibly face sanctions yourself if you were too quick to unlock the gates to her facility.
And we've heard from the defense's side, and their argument being that she was permitted to have these books and materials and stuff like that. But what do you think that prosecutors are going to use in order to prevent Morgan Geyser from not being released?
I think that they will read the passages out loud, and I think they'll say, is this someone who should be allowed to leave? Look what she was focused on. This is someone who has delusions, who committed a heinous crime previously, and now you're just going to let her walk out the door. She's never served a day in prison for it other than pretrial detention, but she was just a juvenile. So now she's an adult, and she's been in a facility, and apparently the facility is not very strict if they don't know that this book was in their library, or they're not sure the people who are visiting her. So there are a lot of unanswered questions here. I would not be quick to release her. I would share the concerns of the victim's family and the concerns of prosecutors, and I would make sure that there are no threats of public safety before she's released.
Yeah, and it can be a very scary situation given if something terrible like what had happened to Peyton Lautner were to happen again.
Well, now we're on notice. Before, 12-year-old girls, who knew this would happen? But now we're on notice. And if, God forbid, another tragedy occurs, then everyone who supported her release should be held accountable in some way, at the very least, just morally.
And we'll see what all comes and unfolds during that hearing on Thursday. Dave Ehrenberg, always great to have you on, and I appreciate so much your insight into this. Before we sign you off, anything else you'd like to add?
I just want to encourage people to check out my YouTube channel, Court Authorities, and I discuss law, politics, and true crime. And Miss Elizabeth, thank you for having me on your show. I love doing these interviews with you.
And always great to have you on. Dave, again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Morgan Geyser's next hearing is scheduled for Thursday, March 6th. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Elizabeth Millner.